So even if he's right that some of the apostles were illiterate.
Oh, so it's this kind of thing. Like you're going to show me a Christian saying something?
Yeah, that's kind of my thing.
Okay. I've never done this. This is new.
Have you ever heard of Frank Turek?
No.
Well, then I apologize up front. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Today we're joined by New Testament scholar, professor, and author, Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh.
Nice to meet you.
She recently launched a fascinating new course called Unforgettable Footprints of the Pauline Legacy, Lasting Impacts of Apostle Paul.
Hello, I'm Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh, and welcome to this series of lectures on the Apostle Paul. Who is Paul to begin with? And that'll help give us a foundation for thinking about a number of other topics related to his structure of thought, what we might call his theology, as well as looking at some specific passages from, I think, two of his best letters. There's kind of an arc to the course where I start with the historical Paul, and then I try to fill in what I know about the context of his life, not based on things, again, like Acts that come later, church history, but based on what I know about the ancient Mediterranean world. When you strip away 2,000 years of interpretation and discussion and theology from Paul, I think you get a very, very different image of Paul, of course, but also what we might call the historical Jesus or Jesus in general. And then by the end of it, we start to think about the legacy, let's call it, of Paul. How has he influenced culture? How has he influenced law? How has he influenced ideas of Western morality?
And we'll talk more about that later. But for now, are you ready to see what Frank has to say?
Sure.
Okay.
I was looking at on your website where you've posted the Bart Ehrman video, asking if we could answer the objections that he was giving. One thing that he mentioned that I had not heard before was he talked about that the Gospels could not have been written by the disciples because they were illiterate. But the thing he brought up that I didn't know how you would answer is that they were written in educated Greek with a knowledge of Greek composition. Mm-hmm. How do you explain the disciples writing in an educated Greek?
Is that actually an accurate assessment? Were the Gospels written in educated Greek?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's often discussion about whether or not the Greek itself reflects some kind of, especially with sentence structure. This is something, for example, people say with Mark, that there might have been a precursor to this, like maybe a Hebrew original or an Aramaic original. Sometimes people say that's also for Matthew that was translated into Greek, but we do not know this. And these are sort of speculations. And then you run down an avenue of, well, does it seem like some of the Greek is in a strange order because it's trying to give a sense that this is a translation, right? People can affect that. So what we do know, and I tend as a historian to be very bare bones about, like, I will just tell you what we know, kind of unqualified in any other way or dispassionate in any other way. I can tell you that what we do have are Greek Koine writings that are aware of Greek composition. You can see this, for example, in the preface, we call it to Luke. So Luke opens up by saying, greeting his patron and saying, I'm here to write a life of somebody, of Jesus. I've read a bunch of other sources, and you've paid me to write down my version of what I think actually happened. And so that kind of preamble you see all over ancient historians and biographers. So you see it, for example, in the life of Alexander by Plutarch. You have the same kind of preface, this kind of, explaining what I'm about to do. And then you have a structure that's very familiar for ancient biography, ancient, histories of the same period and earlier. And I might sound like I'm hedging a little bit on, is it a biography? Is it a history? But that's because the concept of genre didn't exist back then the same way we have it now. Right. So you could traverse boundaries of genre. And certainly we see that all the time today as well. Hemingway comes to mind. He was a journalist who starts writing journalistic fiction, who then also occasionally writes full fiction. But he sort of traverses those lines. And we have a recognition of that for the ancient world, too. But yeah, they are Greek, Koine Greek. So a common Greek, but demonstrating structure that is common to educated Greek, and educated Greek because there's terminology in these Gospels that correspond with Platonic thought of the period, with Stoic thought of the period, that explain things with that kind of terminology. And that's the kind of terminology that someone who has read Plato, who's aware of Stoic thought, Platonic thought, would have used.
Well, first of all, I would ask Bart Ehrman, what evidence does he have that the people who wrote the Gospels were uneducated? Why does he say that? He just asserts that.
Okay, so you want me to just jump in?
Go for it.
Well, okay, so a couple of things here. I'll say there's two things to keep in mind. If you take the Gospels at face value of reporting history, then what you have are Jesus selecting his followers among fishermen who would have not been literate in antiquity because you didn't have time to be. If you're a fisherman, you have to fish because that's going to be how you stay alive, right? They can't go to Whole Foods. They can't go to, Publix. So this is how you're going to survive in the ancient world if you're of a non-aristocratic class. Generally speaking, you could be a subsistence farmer. You can be someone who is maybe a merchant and has more, security or wealth. But somebody at the level that we hear Jesus surrounding himself with, the kind of people he surrounds himself with in the Gospels, these are people who are, you hear the term least of these. These are people who are uneducated, who are essentially sort of not cast off of society, but people who traditionally society doesn't pay attention to. And that's part of Jesus's message, right? So if you take that face value, then those characters, but I don't want to just reduce them to characters, these people who are following Jesus, and Paul talks about Peter and James. These are people who are uneducated or come from an uneducated background. Now, some people might say, well, then a gospel like Mark was written by an educated, say, scribe that Peter hires to follow him around. We don't have any evidence for that other than what the church fathers say, but it is kind of a convenient model for trying to get around the problem that these are fishermen, right? So that's one piece that we have to keep in mind. The other thing is that there are internal clues to the text itself, that they're written after the Jewish War. Jesus dies in around 30. We think the Jewish War and the destruction of the temple specifically happens in 70 CE, so 40 years difference. The war actually goes on for a few years after the fall of the temple. In antiquity, the average lifespan of an adult male is 23 years, and that's factoring in things like disease and injury, warfare. And we're talking about a war in Jerusalem with the Jewish war, right? So the idea that the Gospels are written by the disciples, what we have to hang our hat on to make that thesis work is really the concept of oral tradition, which is a theory. It's a theory. It's not one that I'm saying is invalid. It's one that can certainly be deployed in thinking about the composition of the Gospels. But the idea that the Gospels were written by the direct followers of Jesus at the time of their following or immediately after, it just doesn't stand up to the historical scrutiny of the text itself. Something like Mark 13 describes the fall of the temple in such detail, although, the detail's not minute, but it predicts it in a way that scholars have theorized must indicate that whoever is writing it down is aware that the temple is no longer there. To me, even a more convincing argument is that if you look at Jesus's teachings in the Gospels, the temple is almost nowhere. I mean, Jesus visits the temple, when he's a child. Yeah. He's 12 years old. He goes to the temple and sort of amalgamating all the canonical Gospels together in this summary of how the temple functions in the Gospels. But Jesus's teachings are a version of Judaism without the temple. He's not telling people go to the temple, even though he himself goes there. That indicates to me that the teachings that have been preserved, if they are an oral tradition, are ones and a reflection on a Jewish teacher that didn't need the temple. And that's selective to some extent. And you can understand the impetus behind why then the Gospels might be written after the war the way that they are. Remember, Paul does not care about the teachings of Jesus very much, or the historical Jesus. No, because he never met him except the resurrected Jesus. That's the man he cares about, as the resurrected one, and this figure of Christ. So you don't have any evidence really from Paul other than a couple of teachings and a few facts and a few things that he says the risen Jesus has told him. That's all you have there. And then what you have in the Gospels is a selection of teachings and events that emphasize, again, caretaking for this quote unquote least of these, a message of love and compassion. Sometimes he says things that are more harsh, and he certainly does in sources like the Gospel of Thomas, but there's usually a strategy behind that about in-group and out-group. But otherwise, his teachings are a reflection on how to live without the temple, either as a Jewish person or as a Gentile who's attracted to this message or, reveres the Jewish scriptures. So you can imagine that once that temple falls, people are scrambling, what do we do without the temple? And the Gospels emerge as an answer to that question. There's a way to carry on without the temple, and Jesus gives you that roadmap. And so to me, that's not That's just again issues of a later generation looking back at a figure and at a time that they think could hold a key for them to understand how to live their lives.
That's so insightful. I'm embarrassed about what you're about to hear, but that's okay.
Oh.
You see, there's one thing that you can't do, not you, but I mean people in general can't do. Like people will say, okay, 90% of all the people in the ancient world were illiterate, right? That means that all of the apostles were illiterate. That does not follow. No, you can't take aggregate data and apply it to individuals.
So let me start with something that I think is right about that, which is it depends on what you mean by literacy, right? So when somebody says 90% of the ancient world isn't literate, it's actually probably more like 96%. If you're talking about the kind of people who can write prose literature, artfully, convincingly, with all the knowledge of Greek learning that we've been talking about in this specific case, right? There's other kinds of writing in the ancient world, other, ethnic groups and people and religious groups are writing. But let's focus on the Gospels, right? The number of people who could write the way that, and I think very well in the case of someone like Luke, I actually think Mark gets a bad rap. I think that for his ceiling, he's doing a great job, even better than I could do in any of the other languages that I read. It's a tall task, and anybody listening who's ever tried to write a novel, tried to write poetry, who amongst us hasn't? And then you write it and you go, oh God, I'm terrible. That doesn't mean that you're illiterate, right? It just means that it's a different kind of literacy. And so I actually think those numbers are not entirely helpful sometimes, because there are lots of people in the ancient world who went to school long enough to learn how to be like a notary public, right? Or to write a receipt, or they know how to copy. There are no copy machines, no printing press. Like if you want a copy of something, you hire someone to do it for you. And that person is probably literate enough to be able to basically understand what they're copying, but their job is to be a copyist, right? In some cases, not to be an author. And so to me, that's the distinction. And so certainly the gospel authors are not at the level of like Philo, or I often, cite Virgil, or, they're not Homer. And their common Greek is not, the fancy Greek that you see. Sometimes I draw the analogy between Shakespeare and the way that we write today or speak today. It's not quite like that, but you get the idea. It's writing in a more accessible way. They're not high elites in the sense of have, the extensive schooling and that kind of thing, but they're doing great. And the people, in my mind, as authors, but the people who are able to attain that, it's still a pretty select group, but you have to scrutinize what you mean by literacy. And I think too often we're too quick to be like, well, how hard can that be? Even just reporting, right? But I mean, I've been in school for a gajillion years and I never left, right? Because I became a professor, and I even think my writing stinks. So, we can do this for a long time. And here's where maybe someone might say well, if you had the Holy Spirit writing for you, then you're okay. And I wish, sometimes I did have that when I'm trying to a deadline. But I digress. My point is it's kind of a false argument. You can't wield that 90% statistic. So, and we'll see what he says after this, but you can't wield it as an argument in either direction really effectively until you describe precisely what you mean by it.
So even if he's right that some of the apostles were illiterate, maybe Peter was, some might say. Well, Peter had Mark write his gospel down. It's commonly known that Peter is the source behind Mark.
Is that commonly known? I was getting...
Well, it's something the church fathers said. It's something that was certainly reproduced, say, in the 18th, 19th century occasionally as, a logic for how do we place Mark. To my mind, there's something funny about that, which is that you can tell that Mark has read Paul because they use the same terminology, at least again, to me. But who are two people who do not get along, according to Paul's letters? Paul and Peter.
Right.
So if you can take, and also Peter is supposed to be the rock of the church. So if you can take what is, according to the four source theory, and you don't even need the four source theory. People were recognizing this at the beginning of the critical study of the Bible, that Mark seems to be first. Augustine debates this. He says Matthew's first. There are other arguments, but Mark is certainly, one of the, pardon the pun, the genesis of kind of this gospel tradition. It really helps you a lot if you attribute it to Peter. Right. And so you have to recognize that regardless of your position on the nature of these documents as a person from the position of faith, They're filtered through human beings who, generally speaking, are a mess. And who have all kinds of biases and interests that they have even good intentions for in interjecting or, overlaying onto like events, even again, with the best intentions of the world, their biases and their desires always come into it. So to my mind, especially when the church fathers are often in that apologetic stance of trying to explain why you should believe a foundational narrative of Christianity that's much more linear than the disciples disappear. Paul, who never, met Jesus, pops up. He becomes the founder. Then there's this big gap of time. It's not a great story if you want to get back to the historical Jesus and have some sense of a contemporary sense of historical validity to the narrative, right? So if you want to try to massage that and draw links to make it, again, linear, to make it smoother, one easy way to do that is to say, well, Mark isn't about Paul, isn't influenced by Paul. That must be from Peter. See, Peter and Paul, they get along.
Agree.
Yeah. And so now all of a sudden you don't have conflict. And I see this too in the material evidence as well, where you have all these icons that emerge in later centuries of Peter and Paul sort of snuggling. They're always, like leaning on each other. And it's like, they're totally simpatico, now, even though according to like nothing, they get along. And so I think it's a nice way to smooth over the narrative, but we have no direct evidence that this is the case. It's definitely something that is said, that is ancient, but it's something that is said within a particular context in which there's great effort going on, again, by the church fathers, by later centuries, to try to smooth over those uncomfortable gaps within the history of Christianity as it comes down to us or survives to us through these documents.
Does that mean that you can't trust the gospel because Mark wrote it down, the recollections of Peter? No. People do that all the time, right? There's a difference between a biography and an autobiography, right? An autobiography would be Peter writing it. A biography would be somebody else writing about Peter. Jesus didn't write anything down. Everything else is a biography about Jesus.
Ironically, according to the Gospels, the only one who does write anything down is Jesus. So to say Jesus is illiterate, but the disciples aren't, you see what I mean? Like there's a lot. There's just a lot. There are problems.
Wait, are you talking about
where he writes in the ground?
So, but that story may not even be real. So
it's probably no. I don't think it probably. It is. But, to make that claim like that, I'm just saying rhetorically.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit muddling things and kind of being selective, I think, in the reconstruction of that history.
I didn't have a problem with the illiteracy, but the comment about that the way that they were written was with knowledge of Greek composition. So, I mean, again, are you?
Well, Luke was a medical doctor.
Okay.
He's obviously educated. So why? I don't see why that would be a problem.
So there's debate about whether Luke is a doctor because he sometimes actually names diseases in the gospel rather than being like, a demon did it. He'll be like, well, that was dropsy. And so you're like, that seems more technical. Was he a physician? We don't know who Luke was precisely. We do know Theophilus is his patron, and he says he's reading all kinds of writings, and he's spoken to some people who claim they were eyewitnesses, and now he's going to write some stuff down. Certainly, Luke is the best educated of the group, but you can't make the argument that while Greek composition isn't a problem by focusing exclusively on Luke, it's misleading because Luke's not the first gospel. The first gospel is Mark. And if you read that gospel, it's doing something very interesting, which is Jesus is not the Son of God till the baptism. There's no, biography of Jesus from childhood at all in Mark. The scenes are very, very short, and it's a very, very different kind of compositional structure that looks a lot like the ancient form of paradoxography, we call it, sort of collecting fun facts and miraculous events that have taken place someplace. So yeah, Greek composition is involved, but it's not the same kind of Greek composition in each one, which also makes it really interesting. So these authors are choosing to select from what we might call genres, but different ones, according to their points of emphasis. So to fall on Luke, he's writing a Greek novel, more than just Greek composition, which to me is kind of a fuzzy concept anyway. Luke is very much like he has a patron who has paid him to write him a novel about Jesus. Some of you people who have heard me speak before, like there's a shipwreck in Luke no one else has. So it's not just about composition, it's about content as well. And each of these authors are taking a different tact in how they decide to tell this story that people were clearly interested in.
I would expect somebody like Luke to be able to write in that way. I think, if I'm not mistaken, John's grammar is a little bit easier than Luke's. But here is somebody 2,000 years later trying to pinpoint certain qualities about the writers that he just doesn't have enough information.
No, not the case, because these writings are within a context. They're not in a vacuum. So we have, not as much as we would like, but we have hundreds and hundreds of other texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries, especially from outside of Christianity, within Christianity, things that didn't make it into the canon, that we can look at and we can compare and make judgments as historians, as classicists, about the nature of the Greek, about what we see as the objectives, about parallels we see elsewhere, different kinds of literary devices that are being used across the board. Nobody writes something that isn't informed by something else. So the way to unpack that, if you sat down right now to write a story, you would probably write in English. You would probably have paragraph breaks. You would, which they didn't actually. So that's why I bring that up. But you would have maybe some references. Like, you will be able to tell 2,000 years from now, if humans are still around, when something was before the pandemic and when it was after. They're going to be subtle clues, but they're going to be there. And I know that's not a literary question, but you see my point. Yeah,
absolutely.
We have cross-references and comparisons that we can make. You can tell the relative education of somebody by the way that they write. So he is correct that John is not as well structured as Luke. Luke is the best of the bunch. But that doesn't mean that Mark and Matthew are terrible, or that, John has other problems that have to do with the history of preservation of the text and different, things that were inserted into that particular gospel. There's a longer history here that has to do with manuscript survival, how these manuscripts were put together, relative time period, contextual evidence. I mean, even the fact that these are written in Koine Greek and not written in like a classical kind of Greek. That's significant and tells us something. So to say that we can't tell anything about these individuals is just not the case.
You mean it was Frank is refusing to answer that question about the structured Greek?
Well,
I also...
Yeah, and I think it's easy to kind of, there's to dodge it because it's complicated stuff, and it's easy to speak in hypotheticals.
I also thought it was funny that he was blaming Bart for trying to pinpoint accurately that these were non-literate people when he's definitively saying, oh, well, Luke was definitely a doctor. I'm like, oh, okay. Those observations seem like they're in conflict.
And if I could just say, there's also the question of what difference does it make? And that always bothers me a little bit as somebody who doesn't have a dog in this fight, because, I think that I'm not out to get anybody's, to destroy anybody's position of faith. Because if I'm wrong about that, I'm going to hopefully, I'll get a pass because I did New Testament my whole life, So hopefully they'll be like, oh, okay, you didn't go to church, but you studied the text. I'm not here to make a judgment at all. I'm just telling you what we have, right? And as a historian who's interested in how we know what we know, that's what I'm interested in reconstructing as best I can. And so I think that I'm not sure why it matters if, say, you believe that the Holy Spirit is inspiring all of this writing. Presumably that can happen 2 generations, a generation after, through the pen of somebody else, right? Or the stylus in this case of somebody else. It doesn't have to happen right at the feet of Jesus. What that to me suggests is actually a mistake between our contemporary idea of what it takes for something to be true or historical. There have to be footnotes. There have to be, multiple, think about journalism. You're supposed to have more than one source.
Right.
It's supposed to be absolutely true. And if it's not, someone will sue you. Or you'll get, you know what I mean? We have all these rules for writing and how to determine historicity of something in modernity. And we're not as comfortable with the idea that it comes from a vision. It came from a divination experience. It came from, the testimony of the testimony of the testimony of somebody who came generations. We're not as comfortable with it. And so I think we need to do some self-reflecting on why we have a problem with it.
We obviously have the documents, so the question is, are the documents telling the truth? Even if we were to say they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I agree, I think they were, but even if they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are they good? Are they documents that contain eyewitness testimony? And I think you can show beyond a reasonable doubt they are.
Can we show without a reasonable doubt that the documents are eyewitness testimony?
I think this is the most complicated, I think, of the questions. I think that what you have is, again, Greek composition. That's a fair way to put it, just to keep it within the language of what we've seen. You have allusions to other kinds of writing. You have cross-references to things like philosophy. Everything we've talked about, we can tell the Synoptic Gospels are reading at least each other, whatever configuration you want, but we think probably Mark first, reading the Hebrew Scriptures. Whatever element of these Gospels, if there is eyewitness testimonies, quote unquote, or an oral tradition present, it's really hard to distinguish it from all of this other kind of material, right? The authors are massaging it in a certain way to fit certain kinds of conventions of writing with an idea of circulation that are going to, for all intents and purposes, for our purposes and what we're interested in 2,000 years later, are, the actual words and the quote unquote truth of, what he actually said. I'm also not sure people in the ancient world had the same kind of hang up. The idea was to get an impression of what Jesus, like an impression of his message. And you have acts of translation going on here that complicate things even more, because if the Gospels are written in Greek and Jesus is speaking Aramaic, by that alone, you have an act of translation to even communicate what we might call the oral tradition or the eyewitness testimony. So I would say some portion of it, according to Luke, probably does come from those sorts of sources. Can I determine what they are? There's probably a way to do it methodologically where you say, anything that I can find in any other kind of literature of the era, take that out. There are kinds of criteria that you could devise. I don't know how far that would get you. So I think we can say it's probably there, but I would focus on the global message, not on the individual sayings or on, this kind of ticky-tack, like what's true and what's not. I'm not sure that gets us very far.
I don't have a problem with the legitimacy of the Gospels. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering if there was a resolution to the fact that he's saying that they were written in educated Greek. You've covered Luke. Mm-hmm. You've covered John. You've covered Mark. Matthew also. Would you say that if it is written in educated Greek, that it was a scribe that was involved in the...
Well, and I'm no expert on the Gospel of Matthew, but Matthew is written to the Hebrews. Matthew is written to the Jews. In fact, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, he quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel, and he is trying to get Jews to believe that Jesus is the true Israel. So he may have written his original gospel in Hebrew.
Okay. And
then somebody translated it into Greek because Greek was the common language of the day.
You said before that you actually... It seems like maybe you entertain that Matthew or some of these Gospels are originally written in Hebrew and then translated?
No, I mean, it's an argument you see in scholarship.
Okay.
It's not an argument you see so much in scholarship recently. By recently, I mean like the last 80 years. It happens, but it was more of a position, I would say, in the early 20th century and the 19th century. And somebody might come after me for that and but I'm just thinking kind of statistically in my own travels, of reading all of this scholarship. It's something that you can see. And I sometimes see it also in concordances. These do exist, or in, lexica that try to go through. And so for somebody who doesn't know Greek maybe, but wants to look up individual words out of curiosity, you can sometimes see an encyclopedic reference that makes this kind of claim. But again, I think you can make a claim that is perhaps just as valid from the position of thinking about authorship, that someone might put in a couple of, phrases. Certainly there are in the Gospels a couple of phrases in Aramaic that give, let's call it a patina to the text, because you're writing about Judea, you're writing about the Galilee, and you're writing about people who are Judeans, right? So you want to give that kind of character to the text, and that's not unprecedented in the ancient world either. So no, I can only work with what I have, and what I have are later Greek texts, much like other Greek texts of the 1st and 2nd century, that just happen to be telling the story of a wonder worker and holy man named Jesus. So I don't put too much stock in that.
And do you agree with the superficial characterization that Sunday school answer that Matthew was written to the Jews and that was his point?
No, he cites the Hebrew Bible a lot, certainly. Maybe it seems like more than the others. I think in part because he's using Mark, and I think he's just trying to demonstrate this was predicted, this was predicted. It just shows the power of the scriptures at that time. I think there are a couple of things that have to be imagined to make that claim. One is that non-Jews, Gentiles, are completely unaware or disinterested in the Hebrew Bible. Not the case. We know that's not the case. Just because people were not Jewish, there is a category that we refer to as God-fearers of Gentiles who would go to synagogue. Gentiles are interested generally, I'm thinking about just the broad Roman world, the Greeks are interested in ancient religions and ancient books. And, the Hebrew Bible is one of these books. And so they're interested in prophecy. They're interested in the holistic picture. It's not just to Jewish people to prove to them through their own scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. Perhaps that is one way it's used. But the other thing we see from Matthew that I think is underappreciated, and the scholar Aaron Roberts has written quite a bit about this, is there is a lot of stoicism in Matthew, a lot. The way that Jesus handles anger is so much. She has a book forthcoming on this. And so to just say it quotes the Hebrew Bible, therefore it's for Jewish people, it's too simplistic an argument, and it has to willfully eliminate from analysis things like the amount of stoicism or, other kinds of, again, let's use the language you see here, Greek composition or Greek ideas or vocabulary or just, that broader Mediterranean world. It's all represented in these texts. And to eliminate one selectively over the other, it just doesn't give you the full picture. And if I could say, I love this woman because she's
right?
Yes. So I like that she doesn't back down and, she's trying to get an answer to her question. And I think it's interesting that she wants more, she keeps pressing for more. And it just shows, how interesting this material can be.
In fact, it's widely believed that while Jesus spoke Aramaic, the writers of the Gospels wrote them down in Greek. Maybe Matthew wrote his in Hebrew. So it's already a translation.
I said that too.
You did.
So not that far off.
But the truth still comes through.
And that's the end. We made it. Now, did anything we talked about in there relate in any way to your upcoming Paul course?
Yeah, I would say let's answer that two ways. One is kind of methodology, right? Which is something I said in the course of our conversation or in my commentary, which is I just try to tell you what I know based on not reading into it with no, horse in the race, dog in the fight, whatever metaphor you want to use. Let me tell you, to the best of my knowledge, having studied this for way too long now, decades, the best information I can give you on what kind of lens to bring to these materials, and also that self-critical lens to say, what are we really asking for when we ask certain questions? So it's a two-way street. It's looking at the evidence before us to the extent that it survives, but also turning that back on ourselves and asking the questions of why am I pushing a narrative in a certain way or asking a question the way I'm asking it, or what am I seeking, and asking a question in a certain way. And does that reveal that I'm looking for a particular kind of answer? And that resistance, that space between that kind of self-reflection, I think is really important. And I try to bring that to the Paul course by just starting off with, okay, let me tell you the nature of these documents and what can I tell from these documents and how can I fill in the blanks from what I know, not about Christianity, but the greater Mediterranean world for the things that we're all curious about and we want answers to. And I try to be very honest about the things that we just don't know. How did Paul talk to James and Peter when he went to Jerusalem if he speaks Greek and they're speaking Aramaic? There are these problems. I tried to be just very plain about, here's a problem and here's how we can weigh it based on what is out there. So I try to give you as much of a clear view of that material as I possibly can. And then in terms of content, what I try to do is really kind of take you on a journey of the first century world. What is that context in which these documents, and it's not just Paul, because Paul, I think, is the most important because he is that foundation, to my mind, of all the material that comes after. And he's an incredibly important thinker for us even today, for 2,000 years. Most of our laws, most of our moral ideas, and, the influence of Christianity, you can argue all come from the mind of this one Pharisee from the first century who had this innovative read on the Hebrew scriptures, on the nature of Christ, and that Jesus of Nazareth was that man. And so I just try to bring that all together in this course.
Well, I'm going to sign up just to find out how they talk to each other. I've never thought about that before. That's crazy.
I have,
man.
I have a list of questions that, in cocktail situations with other scholars, I'm like, so, how do we figure this out? So, these are all of the kind of problems that I try to give you the premise. I try to give you the best answer that I can, and I try to be honest about what I know and what I don't know. So at least for that, I know, hopefully the course is worth it.
Well, I've actually started it, and it's definitely worth every penny and every minute. Dr. Walsh has insights into the New Testament that you don't read a lot or hear a lot, but are absolutely elucidating. To sign up for the course, head over to tinyurl.com/RobynPaul. That's RobynPaul. as shown on screen, or tap on the link in the description. And by doing that, you'll be helping out the channel, which I greatly appreciate. And speaking of appreciation, thank you so much for your time today, Robyn.
Thank you very much for having me.
For more scholars hanging out with me to look at the claims of Christians, tap on the video on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.